time, we're going to try a little bit of a different format. Me and Sid have talked about this being a little bit more of an educational podcast in the sense that we can relay some information in the first half of the podcast where we're just questioning things and trying to learn. And the second half of the podcast, or it being mixed into each and interweaved, we can have answers to those questions and try to see if we can pull some more value out of the certain things that we talk about. So, Sid, do you want to kind of start us off?
Yeah, but before I start us off, again, to expand upon what you were saying, I think we might have a bit of a choppy podcast. That's one thing we're kind of testing to see what the outcome of this will be. But like Kaushik said, the idea is to have some questioning phase and then interleave it with a recording from a later time after we've researched the questions that we've had and keep going back and forth between the question and the research to kind of actually provide value to our listeners.
And the first conversation that we're going to have is hopefully going to start at some point and end in a relatively, similar sphere. It's not that, we have certain topics that we have written down. It's literally just us starting from somewhere and trying to get somewhere else. So hopefully it's not just random topic and it's something that we can actually follow throughout the podcast. Just trying to avoid it just being like a little, just a clippy, I guess, educational content sort of thing. It's still going to be a podcast, but a little bit more, value-based and educational.
Okay, so I think the kind of topic we wanted to start with this podcast was the idea of money. I guess also the stock market and those kinds of things. So, Kaushik, do you have a meta question you want to start with?
Sure. I think everyone understands, obviously, what money is. There's a few things that I feel like I still haven't wrapped my head around. The fact that it's like a fiat currency, basically it doesn't, represent anything. It in itself doesn't have value, but we determine that it has value. So if people just decided that the dollar doesn't mean anything, it technically wouldn't mean something, is my understanding. I know we had a gold standard where it was based off gold, but I think some president took it off of the gold standard and doesn't really have any value now. So basically, where does money come from? We know it's printed. How much of it is in the world? Is there a limit to how much there can be printed? How do other countries view the dollar? Just really the basics. I just feel like I don't understand, aside from the fact that, like everyone just knows more money printed equals more inflation. So outside of that, I feel like I just don't have a good understanding of what money is.
Yeah, and I also think it would be cool to compare the tenets of like our currency that we have now in terms of dollars and cash and coins and that kind of thing, and compare it to the tenets of like now cryptocurrencies. Like, for example, cryptocurrencies right now, to my basic understanding, is the amount of work you do and the amount of coins available dictates the price of the cryptocurrency. So I wonder if it's similar to like the original tenets of money, which does like the actual effort you put in to make the money and distribute it equate to the like what $1 gets you. So I wonder if it has anything to do with that. And also I think it would be interesting to see the origins of modern money. Like what were their ideas behind it? Because they had to have decided like, oh, I'm going to make $100 bills, or I'm going to make $1,000 bills. Right. And what was their reasoning as it relates to the population at the time? I think that would be an interesting look as well.
Definitely. Yeah, I think, when we look at history books, we see people trading like shillings or literal metal as like a way to kind of accrue value to a certain physical object. But, now it's just a piece of paper. And I think a lot of people know that things like, I think nickels cost more to make than they actually are, valued, in the sense that copper is pennies, and I think nickel might be something else. But basically, there's actually somebody who I think literally bought 1,000 nickels, traded it in, like melted it down, and then just made more money off of it, just to show that it's almost like weird how America makes these things that are just more expensive to make than they actually are valued. So yeah, I think that's a good place to kind of think about it. Why did money come about? Why did we jump off of physical things to represent currency, and how we can explore that. But to go on to the next point about what you said, cryptocurrency, that I feel like is something that's confusing to me.
Yeah.
It's also similar in the sense that if no one decided that cryptocurrencies means anything, we just wouldn't really have cryptocurrency. But I know there's some absolutely like staunch believers all across the world in the sense that crypto is going to be the future. So I don't think it's ever going to lose value, but it certainly is also still people driven and is, I guess, in a way fiat currency, but I'm not really sure about that.
If you take away like the money aspect, I think people buying in to things inherently creates value. I think
Mm,
we've seen that. Like, even if you think about like sports, right? What is sports if people don't buy into the idea that it's an entertainment, or buy into the idea that I have a team from my city and we're going to win the Super Bowl, or things like that, right? So I
right.
think the idea of how much people believe and buy in has always been and continues to integrate itself with all parts of society in terms of creating value. Um, there's still obviously like the needed things like food, shelter. These things will always
Mm,
have value because people need them, but belief has always equated to value, I think, still.
right. Yeah. And I think like if you just think about the basic things like food, shelter, um, all those things just I guess like it all makes sense to have value, but then like something like money, which is just it's something we put value on that provides value to someone else. I don't know. It's a weird concept to me still. I still kind of haven't figured it out. So, um, is there? I guess money and crypto are the two things that I guess we can explore. Is there anything else that comes to mind um,
Mm.
that
Uh,
piggyback off of that?
well, before we do that, I just want to say one more
Yeah.
thing that I just thought about. One hunch I have for why money needed to come in the first place
Mm,
is to further create parts of something that you can't barter. For
mm,
example, if I needed a house, I don't have anything where I can just give you, like, I can't give you a house for a house,
yeah.
right? I don't have anything valuable enough to barter something that is of such value in a sense.
Right.
And I think they needed ways to get compound a little bit of value over a longer period of time from different sources so that I could in aggregate barter that with for something like a house. That's my guess of one of the
Mm,
reasons it came.
All right, guys, we're back after a few days of research. Me and Sid took a few different approaches in terms of how we research, but we're excited to put it together and see if we can make sense of money as a whole. I think to start off with, I can kind of explain what fiat currency was, as it was something that we kind of discussed a lot in the last clip. So, fiat currency is a currency that doesn't have any backing. So, in the sense, if you would trade gold for gold, you would know how much gold you're giving and receiving, and gold has an intrinsic value because you can actually use it for something. But something like just paper money, it doesn't really have value in itself, and it just represents value based on the trust that that currency has. So let's say tomorrow, if we decided that the dollar doesn't mean anything, technically it just wouldn't mean anything. But you can't do the same thing with gold because it still has the intrinsic value as being gold itself. So that's kind of the differences between fiat money and a currency that's actually backed by something.
Okay, interesting. Wait, but one thing I don't get about that
Yeah.
is technically if we just decided that gold was like a rock, it would lose its value, right? I mean,
Yeah, I think see, yeah, I was wondering about that too, but I think based on just the historical backing that it has as a mineral that's been used for so long and has some sort of like
core
I don't
properties
know,
and stuff.
like yeah, core properties behind it, and I think it's a little bit psychological that gold has this value too. So it is interesting. I'm not sure the practical application of gold anymore. I mean, there's
Hmm.
obviously a lot, but you know, how much can someone use in the daily value to say it as intrinsic value? I'm not sure, but I think it has much more than obviously
More
just
than paper,
having
at least.
a piece of
Yeah.
paper, right? So yeah, but yeah, do
So
you want to kind of
I think
go
I'm
into the
gonna.
history of it? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So while I was researching, I was really looking for the first evidence of wide scale use of fiat currency, so paper bills, basically. And what I
Mm,
found was that the story really starts around the early 1300s. Before this time, there were signs of paper currency being used, but they would kind of pop up like a blimp, get used, and then people would lose interest and they'd go away. But in 13 the early late 1200s and early 1300s, Kublai Khan's grandson, Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai Khan, who was the leader of the Mongol Empire at that time, introduced something that would kind of I guess, set the standard for paper bills going forward. Also interestingly, at this time, Marco Polo was visiting the Mongol Empire, so we know a lot about this bill from Marco Polo's perspective, which is kind of a cool tidbit of history.
Mm,
So some important things to know about this bill was it was introduced in kind of a recognizable way that we have today. They had the $10 bill, $20 bill, $100 bill, and $1,000 bill, which kind of really resembles what we have now. And Marco Polo describes this bill as being extremely beautiful. So Kublai Khan
mm,
spent a lot of energy making a very artistic looking bill, and I think especially it was because this bill would go across his entire empire, and he wanted it to be a
mm,
good representation of his strength as a like a modern kind of leader.
right.
Um, so one thing to note about this bill was he obviously saw the problems with what you just spoke about with fiat currency being kind of valued based on how people value it, right?
Yep.
So, what's the first way to get someone to use something? It's to cut out all competition. In his kingdom, he forbade anyone else from using gold or silver. The only method of currency you
Mm,
could use was his bill. And if you happened to use gold or silver, he would kill you. So that was a pretty great incentive to get people to value the bill.
okay. I guess a
Uh,
follow-up question immediately on that. Um, do you know if it was still backed by gold or silver in the sense that if you were to trade in gold, could you get bills in return, or it just would not be it's not really um,
so he
something that
he
they
actually
used?
did do this. He actually did. So I don't know if it's back directly like that, like how we have like the Federal Reserve or something like that, where he held gold. But he
Yeah.
did do a buyback program. So he would go, if people had a
Mm,
lot of gold, he would go and buy their gold and give them the currency to flood the market with valued currency. But I wouldn't say it's necessarily backed. And when I keep going with this story, you'll see why having no backing really led to the demise of this currency in
yeah.
his empire, but more so in the couple leaders after him. Um,
Right.
but yeah, I'll just keep going. Um, so so one thing I really wanted to touch on was how long this currency existed and kind of what happened to it, and also if we could see signs of like inflation and that kind of thing happening. And so we really
Mm,
did see that. So Kublai Khan, like his grandfather, looked to expand his empire and stuff. And kind of naively, the thing he did was he would just print more money when he was
mm,
running out of money. I don't think they really understood the effects of what that would mean. But
mm.
basically, during his life and then his son's life, the currency kind of devalued so much that they would make a new currency, a new bill, and then that would prop up the previous bill. And then that would get
I
devalued.
see.
And then they would make a new one that would prop up the previous one. And it was this
Right.
whole game of like when supply got too much, they would just cut the bill and then create a new supply and keep it small.
Mm,
And that obviously led to like a bunch of problems with people losing trust basically in the bill itself.
okay. Would they cut the bill like smaller notes, or would you just cut the bill and just replace it with the same value? Because in terms of
They
inflation, you need to
they have a
cut.
new
Yeah.
currency.
Oh, okay.
Like how in India like they cut the I think it was the 2000 rupee or one of those bills.
Yeah, yeah.
It's kind of like that, but he would do it with the whole currency. Like they would just have to take out the entire currency, bring up a new one, and
Interesting.
that would be the way for them to do like a supply resupplying to a smaller supply.
Right. So it's
Yeah.
not like they like how basically nickel is basically useless in, in the modern America, in terms of buying anything
I mean,
with
you
it.
could think of it.
Instead of cutting out the nickel, they just cut out the dollar and then replaced it, right?
Yeah, they just have a new name for the whole currency
Right.
altogether.
Okay.
It happened
Okay.
four times basically, four major times over
Yeah.
like I think it was like 100 or so, 200 years. And after that, it kind of went backwards. People were like, "Oh, this bill's useless. This whole fiat currency stuff is
Yeah.
useless."
Wonder what the
And they
re
kind of
like
backed off.
wouldn't that have a lot of repercussions? Because how are you going to trade in your new money for the sorry, your old money for the new money? Like it's just useless what
I'm
you
not sure
have,
that that
or
was there. I don't know.
okay.
Like I researched a little bit. I couldn't find anything, but I'm not so sure that there was much of that. I mean, I think if he was at the
Mm,
level where he was killing people if they didn't use his bill, I'm not sure how much he cared about like, making sure people have the money they had before, things like that. So
right,
yeah,
right.
I'm not sure.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
I do think it was interesting that, now we think about like crypto, right? It's like, oh, cryptocurrency is valued, let's say, based on what people think it is, because that's the idea,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And with crypto, one way is like, if you use it for transactions in businesses, like let's say I buy a shirt using crypto, then that
Mm,
crypto I've assigned value, and the company has assigned value that I bought it from. And that's how you can slowly build that belief in the currency. And I think it was just
mm,
interesting that his approach was just force. I'm going to force people to believe it. And he basically
right.
decided it had value and then enforced it, which I think was actually,
Mm,
I mean, I don't want to say it was modern of him, but it was like pretty impressive for him to do
yeah.
that.
I mean, that's kind of what happens now, in the sense that like if if the Federal Reserve and the World Bank kind of decide that the dollar is the reserve currency and they kind of force it down all the countries' throats about like what 50, 60 years ago, and everyone decides that it is. So whatever happens at the US dollar obviously has huge impacts everywhere else in the world. So it's almost forceful in the sense that I'll kind of go into the history of FDR and what happened, but yeah, what you said makes sense. It is modern because like it's the nature of fiat currency is that someone has forced a value upon it and everyone has decided that they ascribe to this. So it is interesting. I mean,
Yeah.
like that literally
But
psychologically we've all trained ourselves to believe that it means something and we're
yeah.
sticking by it. Yeah.
And also, like in current day, like let's say a group of people wanted to just shut down the dollar and create a new currency, like crypto or something.
Mm,
If
mm,
some of the major access points just made that decision, it would be done. Like if your
right.
grocery stores made that decision, the government, obviously the government, so all your taxation and everything made that. Between
Yeah.
taxation, grocery stores, and like Target and Walmart, if they all made that decision, I think people would be forced to switch over. I mean, that's kind of
Yeah.
the approach,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
With what Kublai Khan did was he took the access points. He made all the merchants have to do it, and the government have to do it, and that's pretty much it. You get forced into it. Um,
Exactly. Yeah, and that's like it further shows like the power of the people in the sense that like even in taxes, if you were talking about if everyone stopped paying their taxes tomorrow, the government couldn't do much. You know what I'm saying? Like
right.
it's
Yeah.
almost like if those few points of influence have so much influence over the rest of the people, like they can make you do those things, and you kind
Right.
of like follow blindly because everyone else is doing it. It is the, like quote unquote the right thing to do. But if everyone decides that something doesn't mean something, that's how revolutions have happened for so long. But especially with money,
Yeah.
it being like literally the center of economy and I guess in general, like humanity kind of runs through it. So yeah, it is interesting. Um,
One
but
one thing
I was
before we
wanted to
moved
kind of
on.
yeah.
Well, one thing before we moved on is I want to explain one of the reasons I think that Kublai Khan did this, and I read somewhere that switching to the paper bill had a really big help on how he could still maintain control over such a widespread land. Because you have to think, if you're going to do business from here and then also 500 miles from here, carrying paper money is
Mm,
significantly easier than carrying gold or
right,
carrying silver. So I think his
right.
idea was that, now people can carry a high value on them on their person, and trade would be
Mm,
way more easier. So I think that's
right.
kind of the core tenet that we see kind of spark economies going forward, is this idea
Yeah,
of not having a physical thing you have to carry or trade. And
yeah.
that's honestly, when we get to the stock market and the origins of that, you'll see those same tenets of people wanting a replacement to that, to
Hmm.
having to carry something
Right.
physical.
Yeah. I think there's like two frameworks that kind of help me understand why fiat money even started, not fiat money, just paper money started happening. So, I think you mentioned something about the 1300s is when the first kind of use of actual bill notes came up. So, for anyone that kind of is maybe still confused about that, what happened was there'd be vaults and people that kept the gold. and you would either have gold with you or mine it, or however you obtain this gold. You would go to the reserve or whoever was holding the gold, trade your gold for a receipt, or basically what is the first origins of the paper money, and then you would take that paper money and trade it for goods and whatnot, so you wouldn't have to actually lug gold around, which just makes a lot of sense because let's say, for example, you have 3 goats and you're trying to get a cow. In practicality and theory, like math problems make it so simple that you're like, oh yeah, you can just trade 3 goats for a cow, but the fact you would have to have somebody who also wants 3 goats for their cow. So to make that easier, you would make those, 3 goats or whatever traded in from money, and then that becomes a central currency that actually everyone has agreed a value upon, which is backed by gold back then. So yeah, so that's kind of why paper money was even first needed because trade got too complex to the point where there's so many goods and services and the diversity upon them made it too difficult for someone who is a buyer to find someone who's a seller to find the ideal buyer. So if you have something in the middle which regulates that, which is paper money, you're able to actually use that and buy different goods and services and not exactly the thing that you're looking for all the time. So it is interesting and it just
Yeah.
makes sense in the sense that paper money is needed, but we kind of evolved to the fact that we need fiat money and that causes all the kind of issues in the financial markets that we see today.
Yeah, and to kind of label what you talked about is there's an economist named William Stanley Jevons, and he calls what you're talking
Mm,
about the double coincidence of wants. And the issue is
okay.
there's value for value, but if you do bartering, then there's value for want plus value. Like what you said,
Mm,
you need to want the thing I
right.
have, even if it's valued the same. If you don't want it, it doesn't
Yeah,
matter. So fiat currency takes
exactly.
out that want, and you get value for value directly. You don't have to have want. It has no matter
Yeah.
of it because money just
Well,
is a
paper
substitute for everything
currency.
else.
Yeah,
Paper
yeah.
currency. I mean,
Right.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Paper currency, but obviously graduate into fiat currency. But um
Yeah,
yeah, so I guess that kind of makes sense in terms of, how we first started using paper money. I can kind of go into what happened, where did the decoupling happen? Why is it money now? And, how does that benefit people? So it benefits people in a way. So basically, when we talk about decoupling the gold standard, what that basically means is around 1940, I think even around World War One times, the American dollar was still was reigning supreme as the reserve currency, and the Federal Reserve kept a good bunch of the gold. And what would happen is there would be a ledger. So let's say the federal government had to pay, a country like England, this amount of gold. Sometimes it would be shipped over if it was massive amounts of gold, but what kept happening was obviously those amounts got too big, so they would have to keep a ledger on how much gold would be, sent to somebody like a different country, and that ledger was just backed, by money. So that money would be sent over, and is still backed by gold. So the gold still matter here. The country with the most gold would quote unquote be the richest. So it got to a point though where to bail out American interests in terms of dire economic times, be it need a lot of funding for certain wars, or you have a lack of economy being jogged. So basically, people not spending enough. There would need to be money that is infused into the market, and you can't do that unless you have gold. If it was backed by gold, you need gold to put more money into the economy. So what FDR did was he decoupled it, so it basically allows America to use and print money for their own interests. So what happens is the Federal Reserve is able to, basically control the market in a way where they can just print money whenever they want and kind of bail them out and infuse the money with infuse the market with almost fake money because it's not backed by anything and it's made by America. So you get this system where all the bills that are being printed are valued less and less because there's just so much more of it and it doesn't mean anything in the sense that it's not backed by gold. So that's why the dollar has been devalued so long. That's why, one person that may have helped care for the family, which happened about 100 to 60 years ago. There was really just one person working in the family. I think the shift happened around the 1970s, where two people started working within the family to actually start affording and be able to afford things for the house. So those shifts happened because of the fact that the gold was decoupled, and the money infused into the market was almost fake. So that's kind of the origins of it, and it's gotten to a point where people will describe it as like a Ponzi scheme, where there's a there's a there's a promise that your returns on your money will be it's like a no risk promise, basically saying that you know, the money that's put into the market will mean the same, but you keep doing this cycle where if you keep printing money, more and more money, it's going to burst at some point because you won't have, I guess it's kind of, I think the Ponzi scheme still is a little bit, fuzzy in my head, but I can't, it's fake to a point where if you can't promise that money back, since it's not valued the same, it's going to burst. So I think the Ponzi scheme still is a little bit fuzzy in my head, but that's kind of like the origins of what happened when they
So one thing I wanted to ask was you talked about governments giving gold to each other, right?
yeah,
So would they just say like give like a IOU, saying like, oh, like I owe you like a hundred
yeah,
pounds of gold, and then next time when
yeah.
they need
So
something, minus 50 pounds, and then now I owe you 50.
yeah, I think literally what happens is in the Federal Reserve, like the gold gets placed into a room or like a chamber or like set aside for another country,
Oh
if that
wow.
makes sense. Yeah, so it's
Hmm.
kind of funny. It still happens. So yeah, so another tidbit of information is so what America did to devalue gold, because gold still has a value. It's just very immune to inflation. I think the inflation rate's anywhere between 0.5 to like 2%, while I think the dollar is anywhere technically around like 8-9% because the Fed does a lot to kind of discreetly hide the fact that the interest rates are not 2%, and it's just much higher. So what they did is they sold off a lot of gold to devalue gold, to basically to kind of stray away from the dollar, stray away from the gold standard, if that makes sense. Once they've decoupled it, it is really against their interest to have gold back as something that backs it because now they just don't
Hmm.
even have enough gold to justify the fact that this much money has been printed. So it is in their best interest to kind of devalue gold and have the dollar be more valuable. Um,
Do
so
do other
yeah,
countries around the world still use the gold standard?
no, they don't. So once the American dollar is got off the gold standard, since it was a reserve currency and everybody was basing their conversions and rates off the dollar, when America did that, it doesn't matter what the other countries do. Since if they base it off of the gold
Hmm.
standard, if the dollar is based off the gold standard, if once the dollar is off the gold standard, everybody else is based off the dollar. So
I
you
see.
have this one currency that controls so much of it now because there's no physical thing that actually has value behind it. So yeah, the second America did that, the rest of the countries have no choice if they're using it as a reserve currency.
I see. So one more
Yeah,
thing is why did he do that? He did that because FDR, he did that because we were basically didn't have enough money moving through the economy.
right. Yeah. So
And we didn't
to
have
my
enough
understand,
gold to back more money coming in.
yeah, exactly. I think historically, I think people know that America has been the country that doesn't, export in it as much as it does import. So it got to a point where I think the imports, so the value that they were creating was less than the value that they were gaining from, having the backed by gold. That I think he saw a future where, some currencies or countries might take over in terms of the wealth and whatnot. So if you decouple it, you immediately have the access to print more money and have that control immediately. So I think that's the reason he might have seen a future in kind of suspecting the fact that, things might fail within the American economy and there might not be you know, the exceptionalism that I guess America has kind of put forth for so many years might be lost if we don't do that. So yeah,
If I remember correctly, FDR also was one of the biggest like spenders for government backed jobs, right? If I remember from history class, was he created all those like construction jobs and all that by the government. I forgot what it was called, but maybe it
yeah,
was
I'm not
he might
sure.
have decoupled this stuff just to get the enough money to pay for all this, to create
Right,
these jobs in
right.
America.
And
Yeah,
it
so it's
makes me
crazy.
think it's like the perfect time to do it also because it's post World War II when so many European countries are recovering from so much damages and America has obviously sprung into the light as like the savior in the situation. So a lot of people might have been looking for America for answers, and having that kind of supremacy within the global market kind of might have given them that the ability to just be like, yeah, we're going to decouple it, and it's just going to make sense. So, 1944, by the way, is when it happened. So that's
Yeah,
a
yeah.
lot of
And
economists
his
kind of say, yeah.
no, keep going.
I was just saying, a lot of economists kind of say that as like probably one of the biggest days in human history, and people look back upon it, as a lot of them are pessimistic because no fiat currency has ever succeeded. So I guess a little history on fiat currencies. Europe in the 1920s had when the Austrian crown and German paper mark, they were destroyed. Following the Second World War, the Japanese military yen suffered the same fate in Hong Kong, and German mark for the second time in mid 1940s. So I think at all those points, I'm not sure if those currencies were pegged to the American dollar, so they might have had fiat currencies, but they failed pretty fast after the implementation. But once everything got pegged to the dollar, I think it's really hard for that thing to fail immediately because there's so much more backing and um, within the other countries. But yeah,
Well, I mean, if you talk about like at the base level, it's belief, right? So if this many
right,
countries believe that the US dollar is still a reserve currency, then I think it holds that intrinsic value. So hopefully
right,
it won't suffer the same fate as the other ones. But yeah, I
yeah,
just looked it up. FDR had the New Deal where he put like
mm,
hundreds of thousands of jobs for building a bunch of like bridges, airports, dams, post office, hospitals, that kind of thing to try to get people out of the Great Depression. Uh, so
right,
yeah,
yeah,
so that
yeah,
that kind of connects. Maybe he was like, I don't have enough
right,
money, so I need to make more. Don't have enough gold,
yeah.
so screw gold.
Exactly, and I think they had the power to do that. Like at that point, they had the placement within the world economy to just be like F it, like we could just do what we want, kind of in a way. And there's a famous speech you watch on FDR. It's kind of eerie in this one, like where he like kind of explains it. I don't know. It kind of looks like in his eyes you can kind of tell that he was like he this needed to happen, and he looks scared by doing it because obviously the repercussions are huge, and um, so
Yeah,
yeah. All right. I think that kind of makes so yeah, so I guess leading off of that, what is like the next level of uh basically money ownership and having that freedom to use because right now a lot of the people they claim the establishment has so much control and whatnot, and I think it comes from the fact that a lot of these places like the Federal Reserve kind of dictates what happens. It's legitimately just a group of people who kind of can swing markets in a way that nobody else can. So, but I think the next level, if we look at how money works today, is if we have it tied down to a few people making decisions in the Federal Reserve. I think what people want and what the trend is going towards is that decentralization of money, where um, people own the assets and they own the distribution of it. And there's an agreed upon value that is agreed upon by the people and not a few people, if that makes sense. It's a network, and I'm talking about Web3 and Bitcoin in this context, but did you kind of have like a good definition of what that means and how to contextualize that?
yeah. I think the best way to explain that is kind of through the stock market actually, and the origins of stock
Okay.
market and how we got to a point where we allowed people to play into this network of economy rather than just rich people. Uh, so I think if we go to the origin of the stock market, it kind of actually starts in the early 1600s. The first evidence we
Okay.
have of that is the Dutch East India Company. They
Mm,
were based in Amsterdam, and their goal was to have voyages. They would basically a company would send ships, get spices, come back, and try to sell them. That was the whole game plan. But basically, they didn't
right.
have enough money. The main founders didn't have enough money to spawn all these ships to do it. So their plan
Mm,
was to raise, basically, go IPO and have an IPO and get money to fund their ships. So it was actually such a interesting way they did it. So there was no stock exchange, right? So the main guy had a mansion and he invited anybody who wanted to come to his mansion. He threw a party and invited
Mm.
anyone. So one thing was they had this kind of idea of IPO and stock market before this time, but he was one of the first
Yeah.
people to say it's open to everyone. It's not just an elite class that can do it. It's not just friends and family that can fund it, but literally anyone could come. So he invited a bunch of people that came. I think it was 1,143 investors at the end in one night. And they had 7 or 8 cities they did this in, but in the main one, which I think was about 60% of the investors were is that mansion, that fateful night at the mansion, basically.
Okay.
And it was kind of cult like. He had one guy who was a bookkeeper who had two other
Mm.
witnesses that sat in this room, and you would go in and you would say how much money you would give for investing. And at first, what they tried to do, so unlike what we have for stocks right now, theirs was basically very profit share driven. So it was what you would think. Like you would fund one ship, and based on how much you funded of the total number of funding required for that ship, you'd get that much percentage of the profits when the ship came back. So it's like a what you would like logically think would be the method of it.
Okay. Yeah.
Um, and so at first, what he said was you could only resell your share every 21 years. That was the initial idea. And then
Okay.
after a year or two, he realized that people wanted to get rid of their shares quicker because people didn't live that long. So 21 years was too much. So then he made it 10 years. He said every 10 years there would be this grand moment where you could sell your shares to another person if you wanted to. That didn't what was not received well. So they cut that and said you could do it any time. And that's kind of like what we have now with the modern stock exchanges. If you anyone if there's an interested party, you could give up your shares for money. So that's kind of the first evidence of that kind of having ownership in a bigger operation, a partial ownership in a bigger operation. Um,
Okay.
and I think that's
So,
pretty interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
mm, no, I was just saying, like, what's like the biggest parallels that you see? Where's like, what's the basis of the stock market? What was established then is like the basis. Like, how did that shape the stock market today? Um, if there's like a
So
few
I think
principles that you can kind of point to.
there's
Yeah.
there's two things. I think there's one idea which is dividends, right? What he was offering in that for initial IPO was a dividend-based operation. You put in money and you get a profit. You get a percentage of the profits. That's the definition of dividends, right? So he
Mm.
was really
Yeah.
pioneering that dividend approach. And what is interesting is we current day stock market and companies on the stock market have moved away from a dividends approach because rather than paying out
Okay.
profits, now companies put that money back into their company. And the idea is that they will show value instead by increasing their success of the company, basically and so their stock value would go up. So there's this idea that there's this like balance between how much dividends you give back, so you give away your money, and how much you reinvest back into your company. And in
Okay.
history, we've seen that at the beginning it was more dividends based because people didn't believe in this idea that you could make money off of just selling it to someone else, like selling a share to someone else. But rather,
I
people
see.
wanted the profit, right? Because if you think about it now, like a lot of money you make is not from the dividends; it's because you find another person to sell it to for more than what you bought it for,
Right. Right.
right? So
Yeah.
that kind of goes into this idea of like there's a primary market and a secondary market now in the stock market. The primary market is the
Mm.
initial IPO. The initial so
Right.
IPO is called a initial public offering, right?
Okay.
And the IPO is when the company actually gets money. So if I had a company and I had an initial public offering, I would give X amount of shares for some money. So that would give me an immediate cash infusion, right? Like I would sell some amount of
Right.
shares and get money for it. But then
Yeah.
let's say I sold it to you, you have your shares and you sell it to your friend. I make no more money off of it. The company's done.
Right.
So that's what one
Mm.
misconception I feel like people have is the company doesn't make more money after the initial public offering. Everything. So the initial public offering, getting that initial share, people to buy the shares, the outstanding shares that were offered by the company, that's the primary market where the company gets money. And then everything after that is the secondary market, where you're making money off of another person buying something that you bought at a higher price. So it has nothing to do with the
Right.
company anymore, which I think is interesting. People, I think, sometimes
Yeah.
think like, oh, the company's making more money. No, not really. That's not really what's happening. The only way the company makes more money is if they choose to sell more shares to the public at a later point. Because now, at
Hmm.
the beginning, if it was $100 and then their stock rose to $1,000, then if they were to re-give out shares to the public, then they could raise more money then at a higher rate. So that's like the only way they make money,
Okay.
if you think about it.
Okay. So let's say everyone that's holding a share wants to sell. Is there theoretically always a buyer, or will the company buy back its shares if there's nobody else that's willing to buy? How does that
The
work?
company doesn't have to do anything.
Okay.
They
Okay.
may, I mean, I guess in some way there is an idea that they so usually what would happen is when so there's the other idea called like stock splitting, and then like I forgot the other whatever the other word for splitting, you can put them back together,
Hmm.
right?
Okay.
So
Yep.
what tends to happen is if volume is getting too low, meaning that their stock is not being transacted as much, it could be for two reasons.
Okay.
One is the price became too high, so no one can afford to buy a share. So if a stock price is 50,000, I cannot spend a $50,000 to get one share, right? So at this
Right.
point, the company may choose to split the stock. So there's ratios. You can do 2:1, 3:1, 4:1, right? And that
Right.
way, like something that was once 50,000 can now be, you know, 25,000, or half of that, 12,500.
Yeah.
And that would make it so that people with lower capital could still be involved in purchasing the stock. So that's kind of the
Okay.
tools that the company has to keep the volume of how much their stock is traded still high. And on the reverse side,
Okay.
if the stock is too low and there's a number that if you reach, you get taken off the stock market if you get too low. So sometimes people will
Oh,
put stocks together, so the ratio will go the other way, just so they can get the price to be high enough to make
yeah.
sense.
It's just like a
So
reverse
there's these
IPO. Like you
games.
just get kicked out.
Yeah, yeah. No, no, not kicked out. So if you had two shares, now you only
You
have
just.
one, but it's worth twice as more.
Oh.
So it's not
Okay.
like you don't
Okay. I
lose
got you.
value with these. So like Apple has done this, I
Yeah.
think 6 times. They've split their stocks 6 times in since 19 whatever 80 or whatever it started, and it's just because
Yeah.
their stock price keeps going too high, and they want the investors to um, have like the ability to buy their stock. So they keep splitting it so that everyone can still be involved.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah,
I think most notably that happened recently with Tesla, I think a few years ago, because it was absolutely
yeah.
skyrocketing and then it split. So, um, yeah, that makes sense.
Oh,
You know, when go ahead. Yeah.
go ahead. No, you go. Go ahead.
I was gonna say when the company does decide to go IPO, like what percent of the company do they give up? Like how does that work? Is the ownership still capped obviously by the big players and the big, the founders and whatnot? How much they give up and how does that work?
I think it really depends on how much money the company needs for whatever the
Okay.
people don't just go IPO for fun, right? The IPO is
Right,
done
right.
because they need some cash infusion to do something useful, like some goal that they have in mind. Um, so I don't think there's like a set amount. But yeah,
Okay. So can you IPO whenever or, is there a requirement?
I'm
Um,
not sure the actual
just
specifics, but
yeah.
you first need to be accepted, I think, but there's like this concept of being accepted by the stock exchange, and then
Okay.
there's some like bank related thing that has to happen. I don't know. I have to look into it. I don't actually know what the requirement is
Sure.
for it. But it's not a
Yeah,
super
yeah.
easy thing to do.
Right. I don't assume someone with like a $10,000 business can just IPO. Like you need to
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. I wonder what the requirements are, but
I bet it has
that's
something to do
interesting.
with like you need to have people that actually want it, like to buy the shares and stuff.
Yeah, right. So then we know how you were talking about if the the share price gets too high, they'd have to split. I guess the apps that a lot of people use, like, let's say per example, Robinhood. Why can't I just buy the $50 worth of stock, even if a stock is like $1,000? Um,
So you need
why
to
does
buy a
that
share.
incremental stuff work? Okay,
You can't really buy like partial shares in the stock market. I mean, maybe like another person could sell you partial shares, but not like officially, But in the
Okay.
official stock exchange, it needs to be in actual shares. And one thing too to
Mm,
note is theoretically, if like if you bought enough shares, like one single person bought enough shares, they could have a lot of sway over the company. Like if you bought like 30% of all the shares available from some company, I mean, like you could
mm,
actually have some sway in that the market of that share. Um, so that's actually a reason why
mm.
some people might not split their stock. Like for example, Berkshire Hathaway, their stock is like
Yeah.
something ridiculous, and they don't split their stock because they want to keep the investors of a certain like elite player space. So they don't want everyone to invest. So they have
Right.
their goals that are different from like Apple or something.
Yeah. So would that constitute them just joining like the board of directors and whatnot, and that's how they have sway, or just the fact that they bought it
I don't think it's always
has
even
sway?
just like, oh, like now someone new can run the company. It's not like that. It's more
Right.
like
Yeah.
if they did a sell, then they could dictate the price. Like they could run price, they could play games with the price, things like that. And yes,
Yeah.
I think there
Yeah.
probably is like ownership thresholds where you start to actually have like maybe like an actual voice, of what's going on. I'm not sure how that works though.
Yeah. Right. So then when I guess like transitioning a little bit, when I think about like Bitcoin being something like obviously very separate than money, but how can I buy Bitcoin shares? Where is the relationship between money and then Bitcoin itself, like the dollar and
So I
Bitcoin?
think the stock market is still pretty different from what I
Yeah.
understand about Bitcoin or Ethereum. Just because, like, with the stock market, you're buying into a company. So the shares and stuff is dependent on a company's performance, like their performance and also their future outlook. Before
Right.
we go into crypto, like to explain it further, the
Yeah.
way like the actual stock works, like the price of the stock works, is the price is a snapshot of what the last transaction of the stock was. So you see a price of
Hmm.
350, that's a snapshot of the most recent transaction or sale basically that happened. So it's not like this
Right.
mathematical equation necessarily. It's just a fact. Like 360 was the last time this thing was sold. It was this price. So now when you want to buy a stock, underlyingly you have a certain ask price. Certain ask, like, oh, I want it for 361 or 362. And then there's like a bid and an ask price. And
Right.
basically whoever wins in the bid and ask determines how much the stock will move. So if someone who is asking, some X amount of money for a stock, if the actual sale happens closer to them, then the stock price will
Hmm.
go up more. But if, let's say, they keep asking for 360, but the people who are only willing to give 355, and this keeps happening, whoever gives up first is the direction the stock price will go. Does that make sense?
I see. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So
Yeah.
the person asking for 360 folds and buys it from someone at, giving it for 355. The stock price will get closer
Yeah.
to 355. Okay.
Yeah, it's just how much it sways over. That obviously there's like some nuanced math in it, but that's the general
Right.
concept of it. It's actually just about how much people are willing to buy and how much people are willing to sell. That carries the
Got
value
it. Yeah.
completely.
That's crazy. Like you see all these graphs and like the most intense things happening, and then it just comes down to, basically like I get like supply and demand, how much am I willing to
No,
give
yeah,
up for
yeah,
something? Yeah.
yeah.
So it's wild. So yeah, I think it's a good point to kind of hop into crypto and what it is. Um, I feel like I'm still very like uh not I wouldn't say confused about it, but I still can't wrap my head around it because it's so foreign. Because I guess we can kind of go into like the definitions of cryptocurrency, but so if the money that we have today is tied to a value that somebody places, like the Federal Reserve, and what we think about, and it being centralized, and a few people deciding the value and the world going with it. Cryptocurrency is so different in the sense that we there's a max. So there's a cap on actually the amount of cryptocurrency. By 2140, there's estimate to be 21 million Bitcoin, and that is like the cap. I'm pretty sure that Satoshi Nakamura, I think that's his alias name, that the cap that he put on it. So meaning that Bitcoin won't have inflation because you can't make more of it after a certain point. So that's what's interesting. If you can't make more of it at a certain point, it has a fixed value, and on top of that, no one regulates it except the blockchain. So, Sid, you have like a definition of the blockchain? Because I get it to a certain degree, but I can't wrap my head around what the blockchain is.
So I know like bits and pieces of it. I still don't understand how it all flows together, and we should probably have another episode just on this topic to kind of
Yeah.
understand it more. But from the basis, I think before we talk about Bitcoin, we should talk about blockchain. Um, and you can
Okay.
think of blockchain as this, like think of a bunch of people holding
Mm.
hands. That's the
Okay.
blockchain. And each
Right.
person is a transaction, and this whole thing is called a ledger of all the transactions is called a ledger, and within that there's a chain of transactions. Um, so kind of the core tenets behind blockchain that make it so powerful is you can't change it. So once a new uh, transaction gets added to the ledger, it's immutable. Immutable meaning unchangeable, and it's
Right.
public to everyone, so everyone can see that this happened. So you can prove it. Because right now, if I give you $5 and you gave someone else $5 and they gave someone else $5, they don't know where this $5 came from. They just know maybe
Right.
one
The
link
same five
back.
bucks. Yeah.
Yeah, but with blockchain, you know exactly how this was transferred, where it was transferred to. I mean, it's a little anonymous, obviously, because that's a big aspect of it too. But you at least have a proof
Yeah.
of that this where this thing originated from, where the source of it is. So between
Yeah.
those two things, I think is what differentiates itself so much from the dollar, right? And then
Right.
obviously what you talked about with like there's no cap, there's a certain set cap of how much you can make. And what's
Yeah.
interesting is I found this kind of thing as I was doing research is there's this idea of something called the proof of work.
Mm.
So you know how we talked about like the gold standard, right? Um,
Yep.
that you had money that would really be backed by the gold standard. In the same way, we have blockchain and cryptocurrency being backed by this concept of proof of work. So there's this
Mm.
idea that if you add a new transaction to the ledger, um, a bunch of people in the network of that crypto, like Ethereum or something, would
Yeah.
compete to solve a complex number of like mathematical
Problems.
operations, and then whoever
Okay.
wins it gets a commission off of it. And basically, the only way you can
Yeah.
add something to the ledger is to do this, mathematical operations. So the fact that work was done to get this transaction onto the ledger is kind of its backing in value, if you want to think of it like that.
Right.
That's what
Yeah. Yeah.
I've been trying to understand that this is what's happening. Um,
Right. Yeah.
and then
That.
there's
Yeah. Go ahead.
it's still a little confusing. But then if you've heard the idea of like crypto mining, like oh I'm gonna mine like
Yep.
Ethereum or something,
Yep.
that's basically the idea that the computer you can have your own um, virtual machine in the network as a node that uh, cross checks all the calculations that the winning computer did, and the fact
Mm.
that you affirm that they did it correctly, you can mine crypto. You're awarded crypto for doing that. You're awarded a
Yeah.
commission for doing that.
Right. And what's crazy is what I saw is like it's literally just if you can find a certain number, like a number is the final answer. I think that's wildly simplified, but um, it's like the numbers are like the guesses that unlocks a block. So if you can add a block into the blockchain, you have created value, which then you are compensated with Bitcoin, which has, I guess, intrinsic value of its own because it took work to get there. But it's interesting that we've tied the work that's tied here is computing work, and like I've seen that it takes like a lot of electrical power and just like computing power to actually do it. So at this point, a lot of people say it's really inefficient. You know, given that you're just like a normal person with a normal computer. But I saw someone online like there's like chips and the hardware and stuff that you need to mine is like over 2,000 to even get started, just because it's gotten harder. To my understanding, like the longer that you wait to mine get Bitcoin, the harder it is because there's less codes or keys that kind of unlock a block in the blockchain that allows you to have value. So um, that's my understanding of it, but it is so different than just printing money. Like it is that different because it has that value, which I'm not sure that's how we're you know that's how we got there. Like a computer can do, and that computing power is what creates value. But that's interesting to me.
Yeah, and to kind of like tie the bow on this, it's the math that's being done is these things called like basically cryptographic like equations where you're trying to find like I think I still don't get the full picture, but it has to do with like hashing, and you go through like the whole block. When you I want to add a new one, you have to roll up like all the previous transactions and go through it individually, 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 and
Mm.
prove every link along the way to create the new one. I think that's what it is. But yeah, still confusing.
Yeah, yeah. And I think what I saw was there's two parts to it that basically allow for the encryption and the privacy. So there's the public key and there's the private key. So two keys that you hold. The public key, I think I'd like to think of it as like your email. Let's say, where you're sending like a Venmo transaction that kind of shows who you are. Obviously, I think it's so anonymous. Um, but that public key holds your information that everybody else can see. And then the private key is in the back that allows the encrypted file or the encrypted Bitcoin to actually pass through. So you might give me something, uh, to my public key, but if my private key doesn't allow the Bitcoin to be encrypted and verify that it is legitimate and it has, backing, I won't you that transaction won't be able to go forward. So that's why the privacy and the ability to have transparency is important, and that's like one of the strengths of Bitcoin because not just me, all the other nodes have to verify that it is a legitimate thing, and then it gets passed forward as something that can actually be used. So that's kind of why I think a lot of people feel confidence that the future might be that to avoid bigger organizations or larger bureaucratic forces to kind of take over, I guess control in the money sense.
Yeah, one thing I want to clarify there is the public and private key, when they're created together. So you get like a key pair.
Okay.
So only when the public key and the private key come together can something actually happen. It's a cryptographic thing that is used even aside from the blockchain and stuff. So there's like you can
Mm,
generate key pairs. So that's how you can like verify. You can take your public key, try to sign in something, and then that private key, if it matches the public key that you're signing it with, then you prove that okay, this is a signed and verified transaction, kind of.
right. Yeah. Like the things that are really cool that just jump off the screen and I guess like in my head immediately when you think about it is um there wouldn't be any like it's 24/7, you could use it whenever, there wouldn't be any bank charges, there just wouldn't be delays overseas, all of that would just be wiped out, right? I think that's my understanding of it because there wouldn't be a central authority that looks over these transactions. It's based on the trust of millions of people that millions of people and that use it and have this intrinsic value that we're putting on Bitcoin and not off an organization. But yeah, that's kind of like the implications of it seem like it's like incomprehensible in my head as like what that would even mean. But I think what comes to me straight away is the fact that you can like use and throw money at places that are maybe not regulated, which I don't know. It could be used for very like I guess malicious things too. But um, yeah, like is there other things that you kind of noticed? Like what have you thought of when you think about Bitcoin?
But I think it's really cool that like you can see the journey of the currency because I think it has I mean not exactly even just the currency itself, but any kind of
Mm,
applications or businesses that you could build off of the idea of like a ledger and blockchain are pretty powerful, right? Because the core tenets they have of like complete public like transaction history can do things
Right.
like prove originality, genuineness. It can prove, that like if like they have companies where like the goods, if it's coming from like a farm in some other country, you can prove that the good actually came there because it was every transaction was put on the ledger, so you can prove that. I think that type of use case is super cool. Also, the idea of like this majority idea where you can change a blockchain, like the rules or something, to incorporate this majority has like this like a naturally democratic kind of tenets to it, which I think is really useful for things.
Yeah. And I think like the one thing that everybody got exposed to and how like what I was wondering about it was like the NFTs and why were all these artistic PNGs just popping up nowhere, like is a PNG literally worth millions of dollars? Um, but I think that's like the value that we agree upon, if right? Like, is that how that works? Since somebody who's
Yeah,
an artist that made something and we agree that it has value and it's not governed by something central, like per se, like if somebody was to make a music video or like a musical bit and it's not governed by Spotify and we now put value upon it that is greater than what maybe they would have gotten if they were to just get paid for their listens. Is that how that works? And then we are able to like compensate them for providing that value.
but I actually think like the whole NFT thing, it got too much hate. I feel like because people were saying like, oh, like why would I pay $1,000 for like a piece of art? Well, it's not that. There's two. It's two parts. One thing was the real concept of NFT and why it was cool, or why it is cool, like especially with art, was that you could prove that
Yeah.
you owned a piece of art. If I took a Van Gogh uh, or
Right.
painting or something, I can prove that I own
Yeah.
it because I have the original. But in the digital world, you don't have that. You can make copies. So one part is that,
Mm,
oh yeah, like you could prove that you're the single owner of it. Yes, someone could make copies of it. Similarly, someone could make copies of a painting. But there's something about
mm.
having the original one, right? So that concept is
Right.
separate.
Right.
The reason the price
Yeah.
got inflated was because people were like, "Oh, this is cool, this, and this." But that doesn't mean
Yeah.
that it was a stupid thing. That price was a whatever. That's a different thing. But the value in the idea of ownership is still super important. And I think that was really cool, and I think it will continue to be cool. I think like there's no reason owning a house shouldn't be put into like a blockchain, or owning
Mm.
land in like everywhere other countries here should be put on the blockchain, or
Yeah.
even like
Right.
I still don't understand why Nike doesn't give you proof of a shoe so that like you could do like sneaker reselling more to avoid like counterfeiting, things like that. Um,
Right. Yeah. So yeah, I wonder, like, would America and like every other country have to ascribe to Bitcoin for it to work? If or if people enough people used it, like the dollar wouldn't exist, right? Like, is that the general sense? Because I'm trying to,
well,
like your point about the house. Like, let's say now your house is worth Bitcoin. How how does that land tied to the Bitcoin? Like, how does that make sense?
don't even think of it. I don't even think I'm less. To be honest, I'm less interested in Bitcoin as the money and more interested in
Yeah.
the blockchain as a use case. Because I think
Right. Right.
having the proof of everything on the blockchain is super useful. I don't necessarily think that buying and selling Bitcoin, I mean, sorry, using Bitcoin as like a form of money is so significantly useful. Other than the fact that the government can't play games with it. So if you want to go down that approach, that oh, you're worried that the government are not good guardians of the economy, then sure, you could
Mm.
ascribe to like Bitcoin and stuff. But kind of the thing that I think the society and people will adopt first is actually the software solutions that you can have on with using the blockchain.
The blockchain. Okay.
Yeah,
Interesting.
because I think we're
How like
far from
yeah,
the
makes
government taking Bitcoin as a money
yeah, yeah.
because they
It
can't
seems like
tax
it's
it. Like
not
it's
in
you'd
their
have to have a
interest.
government overhaul. I feel like.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. But the blockchain, like, yeah, it makes sense to me in the sense that ownership and people having control over exactly what they buy, and the proof is there, but I'm still trying to think about like the daily use cases of like the blockchain. Would the internet just completely change? Like, what's the Web3 implications, and what does that kind of mean?
Well, actually, you'd be surprised, but there's a lot of companies already right now that integrated blockchain into a lot of their software solutions. It just you wouldn't even know, like behind the scenes. It's just
Mm,
for whatever reason. I think I saw somewhere like Walmart is using it for something. Like IBM is like hugely adopting it. There's a lot of business implicate like use cases for it, just to make their software easier to develop and that kind of thing.
okay, okay, yeah, interesting. I think we're still in like the infancy phases, but it kind of reminds me of like, obviously we weren't alive for this, but like the internet bubble, or like the dawn of like the new age of internet and whatnot. It seems like similar to that, because it's something just so like different. But I wonder how quickly people will adopt it. And I still feel like we're in like not even the first quarter. Like the national anthem hasn't even been sung yet at this game. Um, but I
Yeah.
wonder how that's going to change, and who's going to like come out on top, because the bubble of cryptocurrencies might bust. Who's the crypto punks and all that stuff. But yeah, I still feel like I still don't
I
have my
don't
head
think
around it, but it
that
makes sense to a degree.
I
Yeah,
don't think the NFTs and all that, yeah, like how the art and all that, I don't think that's the main thing. I think what will really happen is the corporations that will build software off of it will be the first main thing to
of the
happen
blockchain.
because
Yeah,
that's the quickest thing that people can control. And I think that's what will happen first. But I think we'll see. I mean, it'll be interesting, I think for sure.
right. Yeah, I feel like with the combination of this and AI, like there has to be like a new way that corporations and companies go about everything. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I'm not, I feel like I can't wrap my head around it fully, but it is something that I feel like we should just be aware of, because it is. I feel like so many people you hear, investors and all the people that may have been successful, they were able to contextualize what the internet is going to be, and then um, got that successful making bets on it and creating, contrarian views on what's going to happen. But I feel like that's the understanding that has to come first. So um, yeah, it's interesting. I feel like I guess it's a good first step. I feel like I still don't know anything, but um,
Yeah.
definitely
Well,
things to
we
know
should
and keep on the radar.
probably get into like specifics of keep learning about cryptocurrency and maybe do some more episodes down the line, especially as like new stuff happens for sure.
Right,
It's
right.
something to
Yeah,
track.
even I caught myself like in general, like during the podcast, I caught myself like not being able to fully explain things because it is so difficult, or like I still haven't wrapped my head around it. But yeah, I think another few deep dives would kind of give us an idea, and maybe we can talk about like practical implications that people are doing that we don't see every day, and things to look out for, so that anyone who might be listening, or just us, can kind of be more aware of it, so it doesn't just pass us by in about a few years.
Yep.
So yeah.
Yeah.
All
So I think
right,
that was a
cool. I
good
guess
good
that's kind of,
episode to
yeah,
kind of talk through. Yeah.
right, right. You have anything
So
else
that's
to add? I think that's about it. I
episode.
I have one factoid that I forgot to mention, but the guy that I was talking about, the
Sure.
nickels, so he actually did end up buying 20 million nickels. Um, I think I mentioned something about nickels being more expensive to actually create, and the value of it being melted down is more than the 5 cents that it is valued today in the American economy. But yeah, so he had issues with
Hmm.
storing it because it's like thousands of tons, obviously. And on top of that,
Hmm.
it's illegal to melt American coins. But what it's illegal to melt American coins, but he actually got a lot of offers for like 12 cents for each one, because it was like a market of people that won't do it. I don't know how to describe it, but basically people are buying it and saying they're not going to melt it. But I don't know. I feel like it's hard to catch people
Hmm.
melting nickels. So yeah, it's not profitable.
Yeah.
The guy's like a hedge fund billionaire. He was doing it for fun, teach his kids a lesson about like um, basically teaching them that there's bets out there that literally there's no risk. Because in this case, there's no risk. If all goes to, um, if all fails, like he can just trade it in for the exact value that he bought it
Yeah.
for. So yeah, it's funny, but yeah. All right,
Interesting.
cool. Again, it's a good episode. I think just talking through it, we kind of found some holes in our own research and knowledge that we
Yeah, for
kind of need
sure.
to dig more deeper into. But yeah, it was fun. Appreciate it, guys. Thanks so much. Anything else, Sid?
Nope. 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 That's all.
Yep.
Episode 3
Keep building.
out.
Keep building. Keep building. See
Keep
ya.
building.